Hello and welcome to the daily newspaper analysis. Today we shall be discussing the newspaper of the 10th of February 2018. So coming to the first article, murky mining. Now the context here is that recently the Supreme Court of India has terminated 88 mining licenses which were given by the Goa government in the year 2015. So coming to first and foremost some background. What happened in the year 2015 was that the Goa government renewed the licenses for second time for these companies. This was done instead of viewing these licenses as fresh leases, because these fresh leases would have required a new environmental impact assessment. So to avoid this new environmental impact assessment, these licenses were merely renewed and they were not auctioned again. So that is the entire controversy. Now, some other aspects which you need to know is that the government in Goa had issued 31 licenses in a single day. And this was largely to preempt the centre's Mines and Minerals Development and Regulation Amendment Ordinance. So definitely there was foul play in the allotment of these minings, on the allotment of these mines to these companies. So in that regard, these licenses have now been terminated. Now coming to the issues which are important here. The first issue is with regards to a lack of transparency. Now what has happened is that there has been complete absence of a clearly laid down procedure. Also, there has not been a strict enforcement of regulation. So in this backdrop, there is a huge amount of cost which the environment has to pay whenever mining happens in an environment of lack of transparency. So that is something that has been analyzed. Another thing is with regards to unregulated mining. Now this unregulated mining is specific to two elements. One is iron and the other is manganese. So these are the two elements which are largely unregulatedly mined in the state of Goa. And not only that, you should know that Goa is an ecologically very fragile state. So this unregulated mining, especially in a state which is so ecologically vulnerable, because it is in the Western Ghats, so it has a lot of ecological biodiversity. So in respect of all of that, this is something that is unacceptable. So this is something that has been analyzed. Another thing is with regards to the true costs. Now here many times a question is raised that this is going to impact the economy of the state, or for that matter it is going to have other adverse impacts, but the true costs, which are the cost to the environment and also the cost to the human health, is something that is often flouted. So the true cost of this damage is something that needs to be analyzed and assessed. That is what has been advocated. Now as I mentioned, the Goa government has been giving a defense where it is saying that the mining industry is very, very important to Goa's economy. Also, a large number of people who are employed in the Goa's mining industry. So definitely it has some relevance for Goa's economy. But here again an argument has been given that the ore that is mined, both iron as well as manganese, and especially the iron ore, this has a very less of content of iron in the ore. So this is not something that is very important for India's domestic steel industry. So in that respect, this ore, and it should be analyzed that whether this mining is even warranted, whether it is also needed. The cost benefit analysis is something that is indeed advocated here. So that is something that is important. Another thing is with regards to the scientific audit. Now this is basically a key word which you should use, that a scientific audit is what is required to ensure the sustainability of this mining. If this mining in the long run is going to have more adverse impacts than benefits, then definitely it is not a viable or a sustainable option. So that is something that needs to be assessed. Another thing is with regards to a Satari Taluk. Now this is a taluk in Goa, and here there had been protests in the last year because of on the grounds of contaminated groundwater and foul air. So all of these are issues that are pertinent to environmental degradation, and especially they are going to have impacts on the human health, and this is attributed to unregulated mining in Goa and deterioration of the environmental arenas in Goa. So that is something that is important here. So this can be used as an example. Another thing is with regards to the rules that have been flouted. Now the allocation of these mining licenses has many rules which have been flouted. For example, it required an approval from the National Board of Wildlife. This was not done. Also, it required approval from the Central Groundwater Board. This was also not done. So definitely rules have been flouted. So that is one issue. Another thing is with regards to a zero tolerance culture. Now, time and again we are seeing that these kind of issues continue to erupt in the country. This is largely because the zero tolerance culture is something that is not emerging. So that is the case, that one needs to inculcate this absolutely zero tolerance to such kind of flouting of rules and playing with the environment of the country. So this is something that has been advocated here. Another thing is that in defense of Goa's claims that its economy is going to be hampered, an analysis has been made of the tourism industry in Goa. Already the tourism industry in Goa is one of the strongest. but this can be further strengthened and further improved. And the service sector the service sector in the tourism is something that should be focused upon. It should the people who will probably be losing their jobs because of the mining industry should be accommodated in the tourism industry. So that is something that has been advocated. Another thing is that if environment in Goa is going to get degraded, it is going to get deteriorated, then this is also going to have adverse impacts on the tourism industry. So in that perspective also, this unregulated mining in Goa is something that is unacceptable. So that is the entire analysis and gist of this article. Indeed, this example will be important from General Studies paper 3 point of view. Even if a direct question is not asked, then any question on environment, you should use this example. So that's the relevance. Coming to the next article, are fiscal risks increasing? Now the context here is that the government has been continuously shifting fiscal deficit targets. So that is the entire relevance here. Now, about this editorial has been written by an expert. It is Dr. C. Rangarajan. He is an economist. He has even been the governor of the RBI. He has been the chairman of the Economic Advisory Council. So as a result of this, the article has a lot of figures which have been given. It is a very economically intense article. But in UPSC, the economic figures is something that UPSC will never welcome. It is something that you need not really focus upon. What is important is that once you read this article, you should be able to understand completely. You should be able to comprehend what the author is saying. So that is what we shall be focusing on our discussion. The discussion will be largely to simplify and understand, to make you understand about the FRBM Act. So that is what I shall be focusing upon. Now coming to the background first and foremost. Firstly, you should know about the FRBM Act. The FRBM Act was an act made by the Parliament in the year 2003, and this was largely to institutionalize fiscal discipline in the country. It was to reduce India's fiscal deficit. It was to improve macroeconomic management and overall management of the public funds. So that is something that was the entire vision of the FRBM Act. As per this act, at that point of time, a target was set for fiscal deficit, which was that fiscal deficit should not increase 3% of the GDP. So that is something that you need to know. Another thing is that in the aftermath of this act, a number of times for many years, since 2003 onwards, the government was working in the direction of bringing fiscal deficit target to 3%. However, after 2008, this has been not followed. This is largely because 2008 was the year of the financial crisis. And after this, the governments had an easy money policy. Globally, this was a policy of all the governments. And so a large amount of money was infused into the economy by the government. And this led to a breach of fiscal deficit target. So after 2008, this has not been followed. Now recently, the now government had formed a committee to review the FRBM Act. This was proposed in the budget of 2015, and finally this committee was formed in the year 2016, and this was a 5-member committee under Mr. N.K. Singh. So that is something that you need to know. The committee was to review this act again and was to advise upon some changes in this act. So that is something that you need to know. Another thing is, with regards to the FRBM Act, you need to know is that it has been continuously amended. It was amended in the year 2012, then again it was amended in the year 2015. Now in the year 2015, newer targets were set. It said that the fiscal deficit target of 3% would be shifted to 2014 and 18, and also it proposed a revenue deficit target of 2%. So this is something that is again important, that the FRBM Act calls for basically targets regarding fiscal deficit as well as revenue deficit. So that is something that you need to know. However, this act is again supposed to be amended. It has been proposed in the budget that again the FRBM Act is going to be amended for newer targets, and the newer targets are that the fiscal deficit of 3% will be achieved not by 2017 and 18, but rather by the year 2021. And the clarification regarding revenue deficit is something that has not been given till now. So that is another major cause of concern. At present, in 2017 and 18, instead of the target of 3%, the fiscal deficit at present is 3.3%. So this is something that you need to know in the background aspect. Now coming to the issues, the first issue that you need to know is with regards to a center versus state issue. Now here, the FRBM Act makes it mandatory for the states to take the permission of the center before borrowing any money. So this automatically ensures some checks on the states, but this kind of a check does not exist on the center. So that is something that is an issue with regards to the FRBM Act. Another thing is with regards to a parliamentary system. Now here you need to have an understanding that, as I mentioned, that the FRBM Act is time and again amended. For example, amended in 2012, 2015, and again it is said to be amended. This is largely because the government in India is a parliamentary form of government and the executive is overlapping with the parliament, with the legislative, I'm sorry. So in this analysis, what is important is that the efficacy of the FRBM Act is automatically eroded in a parliamentary form of government. This is not the case with a presidential form of government where a complete exclusion exists between the executive and the legislative. So in that scenario, the executive becomes answerable to the legislative, and any act like the FRBM Act is bound to be having a greater impact. So that is something that you need to understand. This is an inherent flaw in India. Another thing is with regards to a combined deficit. Now here the target of 3%, or for that matter even the current fiscal deficit, that is of 3.3% of the GDP, is something that is not a complete picture, because this is only the fiscal deficit of the center. You need to know that even states have their fiscal deficit. So whenever we take this complete fiscal deficit of the center as well as the state, it is bound to be much more than what is being projected. So you need to have this thing in your mind, that the fiscal deficit is actually much more than what is being shown or what is being told. So that is something that is important. Another thing is an analysis with regards to the household sector savings. Now even yesterday we had discussed an article on the household sector. I had discussed there, and I told you the household sector is the major sector responsible for the savings in the country. More than 70% of the savings are coming from the household sector. Now, whatever are the savings on the household sector, they are largely claimed by the government as well as the private sector in the form of loans from the banks. So that is something that is important. Now, what happens is that if the government's fiscal deficit is going to widen, then what happens is that the government's share in this resource is something that is going to increase, and this is going to impact the share of the private sector in this household saving resource. So as a result of which, if the fiscal deficit widens, then less amount will be available for credit to the private sector, and this is going to impact the investment climate in the country. So that is one analysis. Another thing which is very important for you to know is that this household sector savings are something that are lowering in the country. This is another pressing concern. Now they largely have a lowering trend because of inflation in the country, or for that matter other greater attractions for investments like gold is an attraction. So whenever the shift of household sector is in the favor of other sectors, then this savings is what is reduced, and this again is going to impact. So at present there is a twin problem. The one is that not only the savings are decreasing, also the fiscal deficit is blooming. So what is going to happen is that the amount of resource available for private sectors all the more less. So that is something that is a cause of concern. This is a vital understanding which is important here. Another thing is with regards to debt to GDP ratio. Now the debt to GDP ratio is obviously going to increase, especially when the fiscal deficit is increasing, because an increased fiscal deficit will result in increased borrowing by the government. So the debts will automatically increase. Now at present the targets are that the debt to GDP ratio should be 60% for the combined state as well as center, and it should be 40% for the center, and the target is to be achieved till 2024 to 25. This has also been mooted in the current budget. So this is something that you should know about the debt to GDP ratio. Another thing is that there is a need for curbing the fiscal deficits of the state. So here it has been advocated in the editorial that the central government should monitor the states who are requesting for loans, and in that case those states which have a wide fiscal deficit, they should not be allowed to take more loans. Rather, they should be compensated through grants, and checks should be maintained on the fiscal deficits of the state so that the combined deficit can be reduced. So that is one analysis. Another thing which is very important is that a band of targets is something that should be issued instead of a single target. For example, the FRBM Act has a target of 3%. Now many a times it is said that this is a blind target, or for that matter it is a red line, and this is unacceptable. This is a very rigid target. Instead of this, a range is something that should be allowed to the government, so that the government also has some elbow to adjust whatever as per the situation. So that is something that has been analyzed here. Another thing is with regards to an autonomous fiscal council. Now this council has time and again been advocated by various institutes, especially the 13th and the 14th Finance Commission had advocated for having an autonomous fiscal council. This council can manage the activities of the government vis-a-vis the FRBM Act. So this is something that this is a good idea. However, this has still not been implemented. So that is one concern here. Another thing is with regards to the importance of deficit is something that you need to understand. Now, the blindly calling fiscal deficit as something that is bad is something that is not justified in economy. Here you need to understand that if the growth rate in the economy is less, then it is mandatory for the government to intervene. And in this situation, it will be important, it will become imperative for the government to increase its deficit and inflow and push some money into the economy to revive growth. So in such a scenario, fiscal deficit is justified, and that is why in the year 2008 it was called upon globally that all governments should increase their fiscal deficit. So this is the good aspect of fiscal deficit. The only issue is that when this is occurring in an environment which is completely unregulated and it is not transparent. So that is the problem. The idea of fiscal deficit as such is not completely in a negative zone. So that is one understanding which you need to develop. So in this regard, what is important is that you understand that there is a need for a cyclically adjusted fiscal deficit framework, so that whenever the government spending can be adjusted depending upon the cyclical structure. The government spending should increase during an economic downturn, as I have discussed, to shore up the aggregate demand in the economy, and this should recede when private spending is strengthening. And at present a contrary situation exists. What happens is that when the economy is under a downturn, then the government is reluctant to spend because of widening fiscal deficit. And whenever the private investment in the country is good and the economy is growing at a higher pace, at that time the government should step back and it should not widen its fiscal deficit. But this does not happen. At that point, the government is also increasing its fiscal deficit. So this is something that has been analyzed. The cyclical adjustment of fiscal deficit should be done, and this is being advocated that this should be done as per the recommendations of the Autonomous Fiscal Council, which should be constituted. So that is the important analysis here. Another thing is with regards to the credibility of the government. Now here you need to understand that time and again, if the government is going to make newer targets and then only to shift those targets, then the question of credibility of government is something that is shaken, especially internationally. A number of investors look into the fiscal deficits of a country and the behavior of the government. So this is going to further impact the investor sentiment in the country. So that is something that is vital. Another thing is that this, as I told you, that currently the budget has given no mention about the revenue deficit. So this is a major problem. Revenue deficit, as per the FRBM Act 2003, should be zero, and indeed the government should try and bring revenue deficit to zero, and the government's silence in this regard is something that is unwelcome. The golden rule of economy is that the government should borrow. It is not bad for the government to borrow, but it should borrow as long as the entire borrowing is being spent on capital formation rather than on consumption expenditure. So that is what is important, and in that spirit, revenue deficit indeed should be brought down to zero. So that is something that is vital. Another thing is that the budget 2018 has made several populist demands, also has catered to several populist demands, because this was the last budget by this government. Last full budget by this government, to be specific. For example, the national health policy has been changed. Under this, there have been greater coverage for a large number of population. For example, the policy of 5 lakh rupees of health coverage to 10 crore families is something that has been proposed. So for all of these schemes of the government, what is required is a large resources what is required. And from these resources, more than 80% of these resources are envisaged to be through extra budgetary resources, and this will put further burden on the government to increase its borrowings, and this will further impact fiscal deficit. So this is something that has been analyzed, that fiscal deficit targets, to achieve these targets, government has to come up with innovative ideas, and borrowing is no solution because it is further going to widen the fiscal deficit. The final opinion of this editorial is largely that it is an unwelcome precedent if the government is not following these targets well. So that is something that is important, that the targets need to be followed. Also, some changes in the FRBM Act are indeed warranted. It is important that this one single figure of 3% is somehow expanded to a range. Also, the Autonomous Fiscal Council is something that should be formed. Cyclically adjusted fiscal deficit framework is what should be allowed. So definitely some reforms are warranted here. So the article is very, very important with regards to an analysis on the FRBM Act. So that's the relevance. Now coming to the next article, testing the diagnosis. Now this is an article which has few points but somehow important points. The context is that the recent National Medical Commission bill is proposing for a bridge course between traditional medicine as well as the allopathic medicine. So that is something that is the context. Now, this editorial is largely a criticism to this idea of a bridge course, and the author is making a claim that this bridging is somehow not possible. So the grounds on which he is justifying his claim is that first and foremost is the issue of ideology. Now here the author says that the traditional medicine, you need to understand this, the traditional medicine largely comprises of three parts. One is the Ayurvedic medicine, the second is the Chinese medicine, and the third is the homeopathy. Now here the author says that Ayurveda is based on the ideology of three dosha. This is a concept which is not be established, but rather it is a hypothetical concept that there are, if there is a three dosha, there is a imbalance in these three dosh, then there is a illness. So that is what is the idea of Ayurveda. Another thing with regards to Chinese philosophy is about Kai. Now this is a life energy which flows through the body, and wherever there is a blockage in the flow of this energy, it will result in an illness. So that is the ideology of the Chinese medicine. Another thing with regards to homeopathy is the ideology that like cures like. So whenever there is a disease, the tendency is in the medication, the medication is based on the philosophy that similar chemical compounds should be given to treat a particular illness. So that is what is the ideology of homeopathy. Contrary to these, the ideology of allopathy medicine is something that is different from all the three. It is that an antidote is something that needs to be given in order to treat a person, treat a particular illness. So that is what is the ideology. So the author is saying here that because all these medicines are medical practices are based on different ideologies, unifying them into a single ideology is something that is not viable and it is not possible. So that is the first analysis where he is refuting that why a bridge course is not possible. Another thing is with regards to accountability and liability. Now here you need to understand that in allopathy there is a stark accountability and liability aspect associated, because allopathy is largely based on scientific principles. It is based on scientific experiments, as a result of which it has certain laid down norms and practices. For example, for a particular disease, a medicine is what is recommended, what is favored. Now, if a doctor does not follow this established procedure, then in that case, the doctor can be held accountable for flouting the procedure, and he can be held liable, he can be punished. But in the three traditional forms of medicine, there is no such singular path or well-established norm, and as a result of which accountability is something that becomes difficult. For example, a person is not treated by the Kai form of treatment, then that person cannot sue the doctor, or he cannot claim that he had been harmed by this doctor. So that is one analysis that the author has brought, that because of this difference in accountability and liability between these practices, it is very difficult to bring a bridge course between these two, between the traditional medicine and allopathy. So that is something that has been analyzed here. Another thing is with regards to the complexity of the knowledge. Now here the author has said that the knowledge of medicine is very complex in the present times, and as a result of which even in the allopathy there are a number of specialization and specialists. So how can one ensure that this bridging is first done and then specialization is ensured? So this is something that has been advocated here. Another thing is with regards to a belief in the doctrine. Now here the author says that for any doctor to practice his doctrine or to practice his healing, it is important that he should have a belief in his doctrine. Now for a doctor who's practicing traditional medicine, for example Ayurveda, then in that case the doctor will have a greater faith in the Ayurvedic principles rather than of allopathy. So this belief is something that needs to be ensured for proper treatment, and until and unless this belief is there, the bridging of these courses was something that cannot be ensured. So that is one aspect which has been analyzed. Indeed, this topic of bridging of a bridge course and bridging of the Ayush professionals into the mainstream medical treatment is something that is a controversial one. A question can come. So this is one rare article where some criticism has been given to this. So this is the importance of this article. Now, based on today's discussion, we have made 2 questions. Please try and answer these questions in a word limit of 150 words. So that's about these questions. With this, we finish today's discussion. I thank you all for watching, and I hope to see you tomorrow.